Hello and welcome to Emotion Regulation 2. It's quite an exciting video this. We're going to have a look at all the different emotions. Just before we start, we just make sure that we're in the right place, alert and ready to learn as much as we can. And just to make sure that you have pen and paper and your emotion regulation handouts and worksheets to hand. So today's plan is we are going to be doing our mindfulness exercise in a moment, teeny tiny recap, and then we're going to look at emotion regulation 2 and the homework task for this week. When we do a mindfulness exercise, we're really looking at this as a discipline rather than a relaxation. What we really want to do is learn as much as we can from the exercise. Think about what gets in the way, what makes it easier or harder to do the exercise that we're doing in that moment, and to link it to our everyday lives. Is this something that happens to me on an everyday basis? The more we can become aware of that, the more we can learn about ourselves and what gets in the way of us reaching the goals that we aim for, the better equipped we are at being skillful and efficient in life. So we're particularly interested in those uninvited thoughts that pop into our heads when we haven't invited them, the sensations that go on in our body, the urges that we have either to move towards or away from the exercise that we're doing, or perhaps an urge to do something else, an urge to perhaps go off and do something else. An association with the exercise. So if the exercise is something that you've done before, and it might be with this exercise, then there might be an association with that, depending on whether you enjoyed that or not. Equally, because I've just said that we may have done this before, there might be an assumption now as to what we might be doing. And there might also be a judgment when you hear about the exercise as to whether it's something that you want to engage with or not, because we attach to things, don't we? We get attached to things and we want to go with those rather than just allow ourselves to let go of that in the moment and engage with the exercise that we're doing. So just before we start, just scan yourself from the top of your head to the tips of your toes. Adjust your position so that you're comfortable and alert. And without further ado, we shall do the mindfulness exercise. So the mindfulness exercise we're going to do is an observe exercise. I'm going to read out a set of instructions of things that I want you to notice. And I just want you to start by making sure that you're sitting on a chair. So if you're not, just pause the video and go and sit on a chair. Then what I want you to do is I want you to just adjust your position so that you're comfortable and also alert. And that's how we like to do our mindfulness practices, because we're doing it as awake, and that's how we live our lives, well, during the day. For this exercise, you might find your mind's drifting off, and if it does that, so just use something in the picture to bring yourself back, perhaps the chair, maybe the sound of my voice. The other thing you can choose is just the sensation of yourself sitting in the chair. I want you to start by focusing your attention on your body touching the chair that you sit in. Consider how the chair accepts you totally, how it holds you up, supports your back, and keeps you from falling down on the floor. Notice how the chair does not throw you off, saying you are not right for it. Notice how accepting the chair is of you. I want you to allow yourself to move your focus down your legs to your feet, resting on the floor. Focus your attention on the floor, holding up the chair. Consider the kindness of the floor holding you up, keeping your feet out of the dirt, providing a path for you to get to other things safely. And then allow yourself to move your attention from the floor to the walls. Notice how the walls protect you in the room, so that everyone going by does not hear everything you say, so that the elements can't come into the room unless you want them to. Consider the kindness of the walls. And then allow yourself to move from the walls to noticing the ceiling. Notice the ceiling keeping the rain and the winter cold out and the hot summer sun from beating down on you. Notice how the ceiling rests on the walls and creates a space for you. Consider the kindness of the ceiling. And allow yourself to be held by the chair, held by the floor, and held by the walls and ceiling. Notice the kindness. So, what was that like for you? I know the first time that I did that exercise, I found it a really quite strange exercise to get my head round. The idea of seeing inanimate objects in a different way. And there were lots of things that got in the way for me in doing that exercise. Was there anything that got in the way for you? If you did that exercise again, would it be different, knowing what you know now? Would it change your expectations? Just allow yourself a moment to pause the video and just jot a few things down that you noticed while you were doing that exercise. What did you discover? What got in the way? What made it easier or harder to do the exercise? Jotting these things down helps us to increase our awareness of ourselves and what can get in the way in our everyday lives and what we can do about it. Here is our teeny tiny recap. So last week we looked at how incredibly useful our emotions are, what they do for us, how we can understand them better, how we can understand what we are driven to do with emotions. And we also looked at what makes regulating emotions hard sometimes. Included in that was looking at the myths around emotions and looking at not only how they're created, but who they're created for and what purpose they might have in society. There was also some homework that was set. So how did you get on? How did you get on with your homework? Just pause the video, make a few notes. What did you learn from last week's session? Are there other bits that you think actually it'd be quite good to go and have a little look over that again? Are there things that you could build on? jot some thoughts down, and then we're going to move into emotion regulation 2. So today we are going to be looking at emotions. Basically what we're going to be doing is we are going to really get to know emotions. We're going to get to know what their individual signatures are. We're going to get to know how they're made up, what their function is for us, what they urges they create for us, the bodily sensations that happen, how that affects our facial expression, and we're also going to spend some time having a little look at what the how we might start to learn how to recognize and name those emotions. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to revisit slightly what our emotions do for us, because this is really important. All emotions have a purpose. All of them are there for a reason. And when we feel an emotion, it's activated both in our brain along the neural pathways and also in our body as well. And that combination allows us to protect ourselves, and it also allows us to adapt to whatever the current situation is we're in at that time. So these emotions are really quite essential for our survival, and our survival not only individually but our survival as part of a group. At the same time, it's really tempting when those emotions are so huge and feel so overwhelming to feel that the easiest way out and the most effective way is to literally cut them off completely. And you could see why that might seem really appealing, and I'm sure you can see why it would be really appealing too. So one of the stories that I wanted to tell you came from Christine Dunkley, who did the video on disgust. And she tells a really good story of a young friend of hers who bought a car. Now, as you know, it's quite exciting when you buy a car, isn't it? It's like your first car and it's really quite marvellous. Anyway, she was driving this car and this red light kept flashing at her, hence this picture here. So she was driving the car and the red light kept flashing repeatedly, and she looked at it and she could see it was flashing. She had no idea what to do with it. She didn't know why it was flashing, so she kept trying to ignore it. Anyway, this light kept flashing, and as you probably know, having a red flashing light while you're driving is really quite annoying. So she was a bit of a loss what to do with it, and she didn't want it flashing at her anymore. So what she did is she prized open the dashboard and she snipped the wire. So, as you can probably guess, she had most definitely solved the problem of the red flashing light. That was no longer a problem at all. However, what she hadn't solved was what was causing the light to flash in the first place, because that could no longer happen. And so what she lost was that valuable information that was going to tell her that at some point something was going to go quite drastically wrong. And what would have been really helpful to her might have been doing a bit of Google on the internet, maybe looking at an instruction manual, maybe talking to somebody, maybe finding a garage that she could pop the car into so they could have a bit of a look at what was happening. And in the same way, when we attend to our emotions, they tell us an important part about ourselves and about having a sensing self that is fully functioning. So being aware of your emotional state helps to fine-tune your behaviour so that you can better match the challenges of the environments that we're all in. And there are lots of ways of doing that. Now, as you can see on this slide, I've put a few of the functions of some of the emotional signatures. But what we're going to do in this PowerPoint is we're going to visit the different components of emotions and how they affect us, and also each individual emotion. We're going to have a bit more of a closer look at this. So when you have a look on this slide, you can see that there's some really quite serious things that they alert us to. They alert us to danger. They alert us to the benefits that we get, the things that really suit us, that enhance our lives. They alert us to contamination, quite a topical subject at the moment. They alert us to when we're at danger of being expelled from a group, and that is not good for us as human beings. They also alert us when we need to repair, when we need to make repairs to people in the groups that we belong to, when we need to gather resources, and when we need to seek help. So we're going to go on to have a look at some of those functions, some of those urges, but also we're going to have a look at what happens to our body, what happens to our face, what happens to the emotions that are inside us. So do you remember in the last PowerPoint when I did the mindfulness exercise, which was a body scan, and I was saying how helpful this is for us to get a better connection with and understanding of our emotions? Well, this gives a really good example of that. I just love this slide, and I love the research around this. So basically what happens is when we experience an emotion, it activates different sensations in different parts of our bodies. So some parts of our bodies we get stronger sensation than others depending on the emotion that we're actually feeling. Now, as you'll see from this diagram, it's coded in blues and reds and yellows. So I don't want you to get the impression that because it's blue it means it's cold, and because it's red it means it's hot. Basically, in this study, what happened was, it was quite a lot of people, it was over 700 people, were read stories and watched video clips that were designed to provoke different types of emotion. And when those emotions were activated, they were asked to point to parts of the body to indicate where the sensation was and whether it was stronger or weaker. So the key here is that where it is stronger, what you get is a very strong red sensation, and when it's weaker you get a blue and black sensation. Okay, so what's really interesting about this is that the different characteristics of the body sensations and how they correlate with the emotions somebody's feeling, and this seems to be pretty universal across a wide spectrum of people. This seems to be something that just happens physiology. Oh, I can't pronounce that one. This happens biologically, and for most people. So getting in tune with how your body feels is a really important part of being able to connect with and name emotions. And whilst this is, quite subjective, the reds and the blues and the yellows, because obviously nobody literally turned red with fear, and most people would suggest that actually fear is quite a cold emotion. But what's interesting is to see where the sensations are in the body. So it sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that when you have a look at something like disgust, the strongest sensation is in the stomach and around the throat and head, whereas the lower body, there's not much sensation at all. And that sort of fits with Christine's video, doesn't she, where she was sort of saying that actually that most of the energy, most of the action is in the upper body for disgust. Anger is a really interesting one, because as you would imagine, sort of most of the sensations are all in the upper body, which would, indicate, that energy, that action that you're needing when you're feeling angry. But interestingly, the feet are also warm, which really I found very, very curious. And it sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that sort of love and happiness, that sort of floods us all over. So when you're looking at these, it's about looking at, okay, so when I'm actually feeling an emotion, there's going to be part of my body that's reacting stronger than other parts. And what does that tell me about the emotion that I'm feeling? So for instance, it makes sense, doesn't it, that anxiety, there's the strongest sensations right in the chest, because, you know, that's sort of where all that tension is. Okay. So, emotions influence our bodies in consistent, universal ways, and the really good news is that this helps us identify and name those emotions. And that's why that body scan is so important. So as you're sitting here now, as you just pay attention from the top of your head and just scan right down to the tips of your toes. What do you notice in your body? Is there any part of your body where you have a stronger sensation than somewhere else? Doing that, just pausing and scanning, even just for a few seconds, gets you more connected with what's happening in your body. And that gives you a better chance of identifying and naming the emotions that you're feeling. So, this is also a really fun slide. It's all about body posture. So not only do emotions affect how we feel inside, but they also affect how we position ourselves, our gestures, our body posture, and how we appear to other people. Now, as you imagine, it's really quite difficult to find pictures of people sort of mimicking an emotion in a genuine way. So I think it's blatantly obvious from this picture that these are actors. However, if we sort of try and bracket that off and just use this for information, what it shows is that there are different ways of responding depending on what emotion we're feeling. And I think what's really interesting about this one, what I was noticing, is the similarities between different emotions. So surprise, yay, is very different, is very similar to happy. Very, very open, very expansive, sort of quite uplifting. And I don't know about you, but you feel like you're drawn to that. You're quite happy to be in contact with that person. If you have a look at disgusted and fearful, that's a sort of, it's a moving away posture, isn't it? It's something where you sort of you don't want contact with people, where you're wanting to move away as far as possible. Both of those gestures and body postures are very, very similar. And sad is so droopy, isn't it? So sad is a really slumpy. It's like there's no energy at all. It's like there's nothing holding your body up at all. Whereas angry, it's really full on, isn't it? It's sort of quite forward moving, sort of like ready, tense. You can see that there's a tension in somebody's stance when they're standing that way. And then neutral is really fascinating, isn't it? Because who would pay attention to neutral? It's sort of like there's nothing really to connect with, is there? It's just sort of there. So, you may not wish to do this, but I just put it out there anyway. Get a look at how you are in different poses. You know, have a look at, if you do like FaceTime or something, stand a bit distance and experiment with how you look when you're feeling a particular emotion. Try and start with something that's really manageable. So nothing big, nothing major, nothing that feels extremely difficult to cope with. So the smaller irritations of life is what you need to be starting with. However, if you're going for happy, you go for it. And look at how you look in the mirror. What tells you that what is it about your body posture? What is it doing? What is it telling you about your emotional state? So then there's our facial expressions. And for those of you who've heard me talk consistently about what the eyebrows do in the skill sessions, and how our mouths up and down, and how that signifies, and how when we're using opposite action we can use all this inside information. This gives a really good illustration of how different our faces look. And when you look at those faces, I want you to just take a few moments to think about, who am I drawn to with these facial expressions? Because facial expressions are very social. We're very social beings. We operate best in groups. Therefore, what we're conveying with our emotional state sends a message to the people that we're with. And that's hugely important, because that either means that they stay away from us, or it means that we enlist their help, or it means that we have that happy, connected exchange with people. So just spend a few moments looking at some of these facial expressions and notice the difference. Pay attention to those eyebrows. What are they doing in different facial expressions? And what about the mouth? Look how open the mouth is with happy. It's like it's embracing, isn't it? So we are now going to visit all these emotions individually, and what you're going to need is the worksheet 10, I think it is. It goes from, was it worksheet 10 or was it handout 10? Anyway, it goes, there's quite a lot of them. It goes from 1 to 10, and I did write it on my notes somewhere. Let me just see if I've put it in the notes section. Nope, I did not. So if you have a look through your handouts, and you have a look at either handout 10 or worksheet 10, I think it's handout 10, goes from 1 to 10, and it goes through all the emotions. And what's absolutely essential about this is that it gives not only characteristics, it gives situations, prompting events when you might feel that emotion. It also tells you what goes on in your body. It also says what you might experience, and then it also talks about the after effects. And this is a really important part of emotions, because when we are feeling emotions, there is always an after effect. And with anger, the after effect is really important to know about. So we talked a while ago about the after effects of anger and what it actually does to your internal organs. I can certainly send those links out again to you if there's something that feels really useful. So when we're going through these PowerPoint slides, I haven't put the after effects on, because there's quite a lot to cram on these slides. When I've been putting them on, I've been thinking about, oh well, okay, let's try and squidge as much in as possible, but we haven't got around to after effects. Okay. So with anger, the prompting event is when we are threatened or blocked in a pursuit of a goal. Okay, and that's really important, because we are geared up in our lives to strive and achieve certain things that make our lives better, or we perceive them to make our lives better. When we are blocked in pursuit of that goal, that feels threatening for us. When we are actually physically threatened or attacked, that is also something that is going to produce a lot of anger, because we need to be able to protect ourselves. So the function of anger is to give energy, to fight off that threat or to get through the obstacle that we're facing. And that's a really important thing to know, is if we know that anger gives us a lot of energy and yet we don't do anything with that anger, it's just going, that energy is just going to fester inside us. It's going to build up and it's going to explode somewhere. And what's important about this is we sort of collect anger. So there might be several things that happen in a day that we don't really pay much attention to, but have caused a bit of irritation that we haven't done anything about. So it's a bit like the idea of a reward card. When you go shopping and you get those points on your reward card, and then you get to cash it in all at once for something. I think the Boots Advantage card does that, doesn't it? So you collect all these points and then you get to cash it in. Okay. Anger is very similar. What we do is the same thing. We have lots of little irritating things that happen that build up and build up and build up, because it feels like it's daft to make a bit of a fuss, or we're not used to saying anything about it. And then what happens is something small happens. I don't know, somebody shuts the door in the wrong way, Somebody hasn't put something away when you wanted them to. You open the cupboard and suddenly there's no coffee left. You know, things like that's a small irritation, but what you do is you cash in all your anger on that one small irritation, and then what you have is lots of confused people around you who can't understand why you've just exploded over there being no coffee in the cupboard. So the urge with all this energy is to attack. Now, sometimes this can be really straightforward. If you are having to fight somebody off, then there's some very good reasons for going into attack. But what we tend to do is we tend to sort of like let that bits of energy out in small bursts, don't we? So we might bang the door as we're going out. We might make threats to somebody. If we're trying to get our point across and then we think they're not listening to us, we might follow that person around and we might get closer and closer to that person. So we're being quite intimidating, because it's so important for us to express our anger about the situation, to be able to say, I was right. Okay. So there's a very strong urge that you feel with all that energy that's pumping around your body. And the temperature is really hot. You feel hot when you're hungry. Your body, when you're paying attention to your body, when you're feeling angry, your muscles are really tense. Your heart is beating faster because you are getting ready to attack. So you find that your jaw tends to be quite tight, your teeth clenched, hands usually always tense. You know, look at our little cartoon character from Inside Out. Shallow, quick breathing, no relaxed, deep breaths, feeling quite energized. Your digestive system shuts down with anger. So you're not going to be aware of when you're hungry. So if you're somebody who experiences anger quite a lot, it's quite likely that your eating patterns are going to be quite out of sync. And your body posture is rigid. You're squaring up to somebody, leaning forward, leaning towards somebody, because that's how you intimidate, isn't it? Or you might do that sort of passive aggressive thing of sort of deliberately turning away. I'm not going to speak to you. Or that shrugging off, oh no, it's absolutely fine, when it really clearly isn't. And then if you have a look at facial expression, it's fascinating, isn't it? So it's like if you have a look at this little character, bless him, his his eyes are sort of scrunched and low. I'm trying to do that on the thing. It's not easy when you're smiling at the same time. The eyes are narrow and intensely staring because you are focused on the threat. Lips are pursed. There's no sign that I'm open to any contact. Jaw clenched. And our voice, something different happens in our voice, doesn't it? So sometimes when somebody's angry, even when they're doing that, everything's fine, you sort of know that everything's not fine because of their voice. Sort of raised, it's accusing, it's curt, it's snappy. There's definitely no relaxed feel about it at all, is there? So, useful experiment is to just have a think about something really mildly irritating. So for me, as you've probably guessed, it was opening the cupboard and finding there was no coffee left. But for you, it might be something different. So if you drive a car, it might be driving around the car park and when you're late for an appointment and finding that there is no car park space. It might be trying to get through to an organisation and getting continually put on that you are 19th in the queue system. There might be something that you can think of that starts to generate a sensation. So when you're thinking about that, where is the strongest sensation in your body? What do you notice now about what's actually happening to your muscles? Can you sense a difference in your facial expression? All of these things are really useful. They give us clues. And the earlier we can recognise those clues and those warning signs of what's happening to us, the better prepared we are to do something about it. So, disgust. So you will have already watched Christine's video on disgust, which is a really excellent one, and also disgust is really quite current at the moment, isn't it? So there are loads and loads of really good examples about disgust, aren't there? So I think, you know, if you have in your mind that you're out shopping at the moment, which is quite a stressful experience at the moment, if it's quite a stressful experience at the moment, you're out shopping, and then you notice somebody cough that, or maybe they'll sneeze. I can't actually do that, but I could cough. So maybe they sneeze, maybe they cough, and then just be aware of your reaction to that. Okay, because the prompting event for disgust is when there is danger of toxic or social contamination. So the toxic contamination is the infection, the poisons, the things that can do physical damage to our bodies. Social contamination is slightly more complex, because social contamination depends on the culture that we're in and the age that we are in. So for instance, things that were seen as socially unacceptable 50 years ago would now be seen as socially acceptable, and vice versa. Things change over a period of time depending on the culture that we're in, depending on the knowledge we have as a society. So if you think about social contamination, because of the idea that we work best in groups, it makes sense that if somebody's doing something that's outside of that group culture, that we would react to that, because actually what we're geared up to do is to protect the group. So the function is to prevent harm from contact with toxic substances or morally repugnant behaviours. So somebody coughing in a shop when not putting their hand to their mouth or a tissue to their mouth currently, it sort of hits both, doesn't it? That actually it's morally repugnant because of the current climate, and it's also has the potential for infection. And we have an urge to recoil. That's like moving back, isn't it? Or repel from the substance or the person. And in order to do that, if that person's still coming towards us, then we can become quite hostile, quite critical towards the source of the disgust. And that's also what happens with social contamination. When we are disapproving of something that feels culturally inappropriate, we tend to express our disgust with that. And the temperature is cool. However, the bodies are quite tense, particularly in the upper body and the stomach, and that's what we were looking at, wasn't it, on that slide, looking at the intensity of sensations in the bodies. And there's usually a gag reflex in the throat, or holding of somebody's breath, exaggerated out breaths, slower heartbeat. And again, as Christine so wonderfully demonstrated, a twisted body posture. So it's like we're not really quite symmetrical, we're moving away, wanting to tilt away. And the facial expression is sort of scrunched, lip curled, and I think that it's here we've got lip curled, face to the side. And if you're wanting to repel somebody, you're not wanting to speak to them in a nice tone of voice, are you? Very warmly and welcomingly. It's quite scathing, quite a sneering tone of voice. Hi, so envy is a fascinating emotion. Its prompting event is when somebody else has an advantage that you desire in possessions, relationships, situation or status. Now the important thing is that you desire it, so what appeals to one person doesn't appeal to somebody else. We are always individual. However, what's really fascinating about that is the urge that it creates in us. So it creates an urge to reduce the discrepancy. So what we don't like is somebody having something that we haven't got. It doesn't make us feel very good. And it all depends on our perception. Now, what's absolutely fascinating about this is a study that was done with monkeys. So they had 2 monkeys, both doing exactly the same task for a banana. So happy days. Both monkeys were doing their tasks perfectly fine, got their banana, happy, went back, did the task again, came back, got another bit of banana. Until the researcher gave one of the monkeys a grape. Now, believe it or not, grapes are high currency in the monkey world. So, even though both monkeys had been quite happy to do those tasks for a banana, once the monkey who did not have the grape saw that the other monkey was getting a grape for doing the task and they were only getting the banana, they stopped being as effective in their tasks. So they did it slowly, they didn't do it as completely as the other monkey. I mean, isn't that fascinating? And we are exactly the same. If we perceive somebody to be having something that we haven't got, then it creates an urge to reduce the discrepancy, and that is not nice. So what our urge is we either want to acquire it ourselves, so we fantasize about how we can get it, or if there's no way of acquiring it, we want to destroy for the other person what we're desiring. Now, you see that sometimes by people sort of doing that verbally, don't they? They verbally degrade it. Well, you know, I mean, they've got this massive house, but I mean, who wants that much space anyway? So they're trying to sort of minimise the effect that it has on them. When you know that you can't have a massive house and you see somebody else has got one, you try and downplay it. Now, the important thing is that having a big house does not affect or have meaning for anybody. For everybody, so it's very subjective on what has the most meaning for us. So it might be for one person, hearing that somebody got the biggest bargain ever in the store might be something that generates a lot of envy. For somebody who's not that fussed about whether they get a bargain or not, it's not going to have the same effect. It's hot. It creates a really hot temperature in our bodies. And we become quite stiff. I don't know if you, there's a sort of quite rigidity. If you have a look at this picture at the top, where her plant's definitely doing better than her plant, and you have a look at her body posture, there's a stiffness to it, isn't there? There's a rigidity. So there's tense sensations in the body, the teeth clenched, the mouth is quite tight, and it's deliberately, their body posture is deliberately inhibited with very few gestures. Facial expression, scrunched nose, lip curls, usually to one side, turning the face to the side so you can see my hair. She's got her face sort of slightly turned. I mean, she is also trying to see how big her plant is, isn't she? And the voice quite a scathing or sneering tone, because you're trying to minimise the discrepancy. So you're trying to downgrade, degrade what it is that you feel that you can't have that somebody else has. And the other interesting thing about envy is that it's sort of like a secret emotion, because it's not really socially acceptable to walk around going, you know, they've got that and I want it, or I hate them because they've got something I don't want. So it's something that we sort of keep quiet about, and there's a reason for that, because if you're desiring something and your focus is on trying to get that, then you're not going to advertise it to the world that it's available and that's what you're doing, because otherwise your fear is that hordes of other people are going to jump in and get it as well. So the current situation with toilet rolls is a really good example of that. But if you think of something less controversial, and I suppose it supplies a bit more if you drive, but you obviously might be a passenger in a car, so you're driving around a packed car park, no spaces at all, and you see somebody who has just managed to get a car park space before you. The envy is likely to be generated at that point. What then happens is you see somebody walking to their car and they're about to get in it and you think they're going to leave. Now at that point, do you get out of your car and say to all the other drivers, hey look, free parking space over here, let's all try and get into it? No, you don't. you scan around and try really hard to make sure that nobody else has spotted that that parking space is about to become available. Because envy is something that's quite secret, and that's why it doesn't really feel very good a lot of the time, because you're sort of keeping it to yourself. So I just want to put a bit of a note about jealousy, because I haven't covered jealousy on this PowerPoint slide, but there is the handout that you're looking through at the moment. It also covers jealousy. It's slightly different to envy, because envy is wanting something that somebody else hasn't got. Jealousy is a fear of somebody taking away something that's really important to you, whether that fear is justified or not. It has a slightly different emotional signature to it. So just pause the PowerPoint and have a quick look at jealousy. Also, have a look at the after effects for envy and for jealousy. These are emotions that you can get caught up in really quite quickly, and that you can spend a lot of time and energy ruminating about. So, fear and anxiety. Now, you'd sort of think there was the same sort of thing, but actually there's some subtle differences here, where the way we are designed to respond to threat, which is the function of them both. So when our life, health or well-being is in danger, that's when fear and anxiety is triggered. There's usually two parts to this, because we need to respond in different ways depending on whether we can get away from this threat or not. So if the first stage is to escape, we want to either avoid it or we want to run away from it. So the first stage means that we're sort of getting geared up to escape. The second stage is fear, because that's when we realise that we can't get away from the threat, and that's when the freeze kicks in until the danger passes. So you hear that phrase, frozen to the spot. It's a really good defence mechanism. You know, if you have a wild animal coming towards you trying to kill and eat you, if you play dead quite a lot of the time, they leave you alone. So it's a very strong defence mechanism that we have as mammals. So the function is of to keep physically safe by avoiding danger. And our urge with anxiety is to avoid or to run away. So you get that when you're avoiding, you get that checking behaviour, that reassurance seeking. And then fear, where we freeze until the danger is past. And with fear, we tend to hide away. That's the urge, is we're wanting to avoid contact with whatever we're perceiving as dangerous. And because our brains are wired in such a way that once we start to feel afraid, we feel afraid of pretty much everything. That's when we sort of hide behind closed doors. And temperature is slightly different. So anxiety is hot because we need that energy to escape. Fear is cold because we're wanting to be frozen to the spot. And with anxiety, it's very, very different. There's a really fast heart rate, we're breathless, tightness in the throat normally, tension in our muscles, clenched teeth, stomach doing somersaults. You usually get that really awful flippy feeling in your stomach with anxiety. Whereas fear is really different. Fear is like frozen and rigid because you don't want to move, you're frozen to the spot, and you have that horrible sensation of your hair standing on end and sort of flinching away. You're wanting to sort of, you know, make yourself smaller. So anxiety, with your body posture, you're sort of escape ready, but you're on edge. So it's like when you have that sensation of being on the edge of your seat, you're sort of getting ready to move all the time. You're tense, your shoulders are quite raised up because it's that sort of getting ready for action. Whereas fear is sort of shrinking away, wanting to make yourself feel smaller, folding your limbs into bodies, because the idea is that we can make ourselves smaller, we can disappear, we can hide. And our facial expression is slightly different. Anxiety, darting eyes. We have that hypervigilance where we're sort of looking around at everything, we're aware of everything. But our brows are sort of furrowed because we're trying to concentrate on the threat. Whereas fear is sort of like, mouth open but down, eyes wide because we're still trying to look out to see what on earth's around us. Eyebrows raised and to the centre, so it's have that sort of weird thing where it's sort of like they go like that. And voice is definitely different. Anxiety, fast, high pitch, urgent. Fear, silent, whisper. You don't want to draw attention to yourself. So, and same as anger, what you're doing is you're generating a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to stay in an anxious state. And so what you want to really look at is what are the after effects of that. So on your sheets now, just have a bit of a pause. Have a look at the after effects of fear and anxiety. This is a really useful YouTube video, and I think this guy explains the cycle of anxiety really well and explains the avoid response that we have, which sometimes can be really appropriate, and at other times when our brain's playing tricks on us and telling us that there's things to be afraid of that really there is no basis for, that are not justified, of the behaviours that we get involved in that actually become really unhelpful. So you should have the link to this when I sent out the link to this YouTube video. Guilt and shame. Other emotions that are really quite fascinating, because both of these are geared up to our survival in a group. And as we've looked at before, being in a group is something that human beings are designed for, because as individuals we're not particularly strong, we're not used to fighting off a lot of things on our own. So biologically we are geared up and designed to be in groups. Therefore, in order to keep us in these groups, to keep us safe, we have to have mechanisms that alert us when we're in danger of being expelled from one of these groups. So the danger is of being on our own. Okay. So therefore the prompting event is something where we're doing something that goes against the group norm. And our own values, which is guilt. And guilt's an interesting one, because although it's sort of going against something that's our own values, those values that we develop are usually culturally bound. So there's some things that we have guilt about that are quite universal. There are other things we have guilt about that are actually to do with the culture that we grew up in, the society that we're in now. So I mean, if you even look at current moment, go transition against group norms at the moment would be going to buy too much toilet roll from the supermarkets. People would frown on that. There is a risk of expulsion from the group if the actions are made public. So, and if that transgression is so big that it falls too outside the group norm, that's when shame comes in. Shame is about keeping something secret, not wanting to risk expulsion from the group. So the functions are, with guilt, to maximize the chances of remaining in the group. So guilt gears us up to action, to do something that helps us stay in the group. Shame is slightly different in that we are wanting to minimize the risk of being expelled. It's when it's sort of gone way too far, where we've done something that feels like if somebody knows about it, they're going to expel us from the group. And Marsha Linehan talked on her video a lot about shame and gave examples of that. So the urge with guilt is to make reparation. So that means if we're feeling guilty about something and it's justified, then we need to put it right, basically. We need to do something that allows us to feel part of that group again. And the interesting thing about guilt is if it is justified and we do make reparation, we don't feel the guilt anymore. Sometimes we need to overcorrect. We need to make a reparation that is more than what we were guilty of to readdress the balance. And so we need to have a look at, what do I need to do here to make it right? to get back into the group again, so that there's no animosity left, nothing lingering left. Shame is slightly different, because the urge then is to hide. It's to hide yourself or what it is you've actually done, because the knowledge of that might mean that you are expelled from the group. And the temperature's just slightly different, and so guilt feels a bit uncomfortable, the warmth. Shame is hot. With guilt, you get some, it's like a squirmy feeling, guilt, isn't it? Like, sort of like, it doesn't really sit very comfortably in your body. You sort of feel a bit jittery, a bit sort of, that sort of, there's an energy to do something, and if that continues, it can feel quite suffocating. Whereas shame just feels really heavy, like there's a pain in the centre of the chest, the pit of the stomach. You sort of like, the heaviness sort of makes you feel quite droopy, but if somebody comes near you, you sort of tense up quite quickly. Both of them have got slower breathing. And guilt is sort of awkward. Head sort of slightly tilted down, you're not quite sure of yourself, it's uncertain, it's awkward. Whereas shame is most definitely head lowered, trying to hide. So you people trying to hide themselves behind their hair, behind their faces. They might sort of be like this a bit. Right? There's lack of eye contact, somebody's not wanting to look somebody straight in the face. And then of course you've got, with guilt, your eyes are up, although your head's slightly down, centre raised brows. With shame, it's like really head down, no eye contact, mouth down. Because there's usually a sadness that also is associated with the shame as well, because there's something about a potential loss. Guilt, lower volume but urgent voice. Shame, the voice is absent because you're wanting to hide. Really want to draw your attention to the picture at the front, right at the top, which is about that sort of phrase, being weighed down with guilt. When we collect a lot of guilt and we don't address it, we don't look at it and see whether it has any validity at all, or when we collect it but don't make any reparation, it starts to feel really heavy, like we're weighed down with it. And for those of you who may be thinking, well, actually I quite like being on my own, current situation means we're on our own a lot more, think about the groups that you belong to, because there will be groups that you belong to or you identify with, and the thought of not being in those groups is likely to make you act. And again, have another look and pause at the after effects of guilt and shame, what that does to us longer term. Sadness is a really interesting emotion. Well, as you can probably gather, I'm finding all these emotions quite interesting. The prompting event is really quite simple. It's when there has been a loss. What's interesting about this one, though, is that sadness, when we feel sadness, we sort of do a bit of collection of all the other sadnesses. So the temptation when we're feeling sad is that we start to associate that state with other times in our lives that we've felt sad. So a bit like this tornado here, what we do is those associations is once we start to feel sad, that spiral goes and we collect other past sadnesses as well. And the reason that we're doing this is because we are trying to consistently retrieve what has been lost. So if we're feeling sad about things in the past, it's usually because we haven't processed those. And when we haven't processed those, our brain immediately goes back to, how can I retrieve this? There's another loss. How can I retrieve these other losses? Because what we're trying to do, the function of feeling sad, is to conserve our resources to prevent further losses. We want to make sure that we have all the resources that we need, and if we're losing things, that means that we're not safe. So firstly, what we do is we seek or we pine for what is lost. And you find that, don't you? I mean, even if you think about, you know, trying to find house keys, trying to find your phone is always a classic, isn't it? Your focus at that moment is continually, obsessively on finding and seeking what it is you feel that you have lost at that moment, isn't it? And then if you find you've been looking and looking and looking and you can't find it, then you sort of pine for it, don't you? You really want it back. And sometimes you pine for things that actually weren't that, you know, massively important to you in the first place. I can remember I was in a city and I got pickpocketed, and in this in the purse was a tiny little pendant charm thing that I'd bought from one of those tourist things, tourist shops. And it was tiny, it really wasn't worth anything, and to be honest didn't have a great deal of sentimental value either. But having lost it, I can still remember now what it looked like, and if I went back to that city, I would most definitely try and find a shop that sold it so I could buy another one. It makes no logical sense, but that's what we're geared up to do. We're geared up to pine and seek what is lost. When this is something that's large and really important to us, and we finally realise that we can't have this, that we have lost it, then what we do is we withdraw, and we withdraw because we are trying to conserve the resources that we have and not have further losses. The temperature is cold. You'll notice if you're feeling sad, feeling really quite cold. Opposite action, of course, would tell us to do something to warm up. The body's floppy. It's such a floppy emotion. No muscle tone, heavy, long sighs, sometimes real pain in the chest, but no energy at all. And that sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Because if we're trying to conserve resources, our body doesn't want us gearing up to use lots of energy. So that means that our urge is, our body posture is to lie down. Here we go. Curl up, rounded shoulders, slumped, dragging self. Feels like everything you do is really heavy. All your movements are quite slow. And your eyes are down, mouth down, crying, eyes misted over. And what's really, I don't know if I can do it here, but if you sort of go, your eyebrows are sort of up here but down, so everything about you says it's all sort of low down. And the voice, your voice is sort of low, it's breathy, whiny, halting, slow. And what we're trying to do with sadness is we're trying to also gather resources by getting people to help us. So when we're looking sad, that activates something in the group that we're in to help people activate their empathy and come and be with us. So one of the things we're doing with sadness is a communication socially to other people that we need some help. Now what's interesting about sadness is what we become sad about. And there's a really good saying, I think, is the degree of attachment determines the degree of loss. That means that what's really important to us causes us the greatest distress. So and could be very different for different people. So a good example of that is a story I told a while ago about a gym buddy of mine who had a few comments to me about how I should be grateful that I could actually do my gym workout when I was having a bit of a moan, which I did quite often at the time. And I could really see his point, because he was somebody who was very physically active. Exercise and being active was something that's always been important to him in his life, and he developed a health condition which meant that he wasn't able to do that. Now, developing that health condition that prevented me from doing some of those things would have not been good. However, it would not have caused the same amount of loss for me as it did for him. Because, as some of you know, I'm definitely drawn more to the sofa than to the gym. So the other thing I just want to quickly go back to is this sort of this tornado of picking up past losses. Because when our mind's doing this, one of the most useful questions that we can ask ourselves to bring ourselves back into the present is what have I lost in this moment? And it's a really important question. We need to focus on what is the loss that we're feeling at this moment, rather than our brain hijacking us to all the past losses that it's asking us to retrieve. So, thought it'd be really good to end with happiness. So, I had so much fun with this slide. Thought lovely rainbow, very upbeat little person. Can't remember what her name is. She's another one from Inside Out. So, happiness. Prompting event is where there is a benefit that enhances our life. So this is when things feel good for us. They feel like they're doing something that makes our life feel good, that make us feel good, that create greater connection with other people, because then we're staying in that group again, aren't we? So and the function is to maximize that, to get more of it, because it's good for us. So the urge, therefore, is to do more of whatever made us happy or joyful. Now, quite like this to be a really happy slide, but I do need to sort of add a little bit of a word of caution in here, because if we are doing more of what made us feel happy, but that something is not something that's really good for us in the long term, this is where we need to start to learn to sort of down-regulate happiness, because otherwise we get caught up in happiness. We get so excited about things that we end up overspending, overeating, eating the wrong things, doing other sort of behaviours that really are not helpful for us at all. So whilst this can be a really great emotion to have, we sort of need to be really careful about the fact that the urge is to do more of what makes us happy or joyful, and we need to assess is, in the long term, is that going to still make us happy and joyful, or is that actually going to interfere with our lives quite a lot? So the temperature, pleasantly warm. Body is relaxed, but there's tone to the muscles, so this is not a slumpy body. This is a body that's sort of upbeat, uplifted. So you usually get a nice warm feeling in the chest. Kind of excited butterflies in the stomach sometimes. So there's an energy there, but it's not an overwhelming energy. Because it's accompanied by a sort of calmness that comes with that, where you feel sort of quite grounded, quite centered. The body posture is very open. So when we were looking at those body postures before, it was all very open, expansive movements, light and speedy. So she's definitely light and speedy up here. And eyes wide open, smiling, eyebrows raised. And voice light, musical, varied in tone. There's nothing monotone about it. There's like a lot of expression to somebody's tone of voice and the way they're expressing things. And then it'd be really good to have a look at the after effects of happiness. The more little happiness pauses we get in our lives, the more they accumulate to make us feel more content overall. So have a look at the after effects. So we are now going to move on to the last part of the presentation, which is about finding a model for describing emotions. And this is your handout that I've put at the end of the slides. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first looked at this handout, it looked incredibly complicated, and my urge was to never ever look at it again. But given that I'm doing the emotion regulation model, I thought it might be a good idea to do that. So what I found was, whilst this felt a bit complicated, the one on the workshop looked a lot simpler and follows the pattern that you will see in the worksheets, the handouts that you've been going through about describing emotions. So the first aspect of this is the vulnerability factors, and we are going to have a look at this in another PowerPoint. But just to say that there are things that makes us more vulnerable to overwhelming emotions. And those are things that really affect our health. Things like our physical health, when we're physically unwell, when we've not slept, when we've not eaten properly. All of those things affect our vulnerability to emotions, and you'll probably notice that yourself. I'm really hoping that you're all well at the moment, but if you just think back to when you have a cold, it's like your body is trying to use all its resources to fight the infection. So what happens is you just feel a bit, don't you? Feel like you have no energy at all. And when you have no energy at all, you're much more susceptible to things that make you upset. So suddenly, an advert on the telly, somehow that it starts making you feel really sad. Definitely not watching Bambi at that time is a really good idea. So, looking at, first of all, what makes you vulnerable is a really important part of this. And then being able to identify the event that set off this emotion in the first place. Sorry, I should be here. So having a look at what was the prompting event for when I felt this emotion. What happened a few minutes before the emotion started? And here's the really important thing: stick with just the facts, because it is so tempting to write an essay, particularly if you're feeling angry. You will want to write down exactly why you were completely right and justified in this. And then have a look at what your interpretation was of the event. And this is really important, because the way you see it will be different from how other people see it. So there might be a common theme of what people see as acceptable or not acceptable, but actually how you perceive it comes from your own experience and your history, your knowledge. We'll have a look at that in a bit more depth next week as well. So then what I want you to do is, a bit of what we've done here is just become really aware of your face and your body changes and what that experience was like. So become more connected with your body. Think, well, where was the strongest sensation in my body? And that diagram of all the people with different shades of blue and red and orange is a really good one to have a guide. You know, if you had a really strong feeling of sort of pressure and tension across your chest, but there was nothing really anywhere else, it's possible that might be something to do with anxiety. If, however, you feel like you just notice yourself sort of slumping and you felt like you had no energy, it's possible that might give you a clue that there may be some sadness around. Have a think about, what was my face doing at that time? What is it doing right now? What clue does that give me? And then what was the urge? What did I want to do? What did I feel like doing? What did I want to say? If you weren't centering yourself, what would you want to say? Gives you some clue about what the urge is. And then to go on to have a look at what you did say and what you did do. And this all gives you clues to what that emotion is. So have a go at just naming that emotion, and then also have a go at looking at, well, what was the intensity of that emotion? On a percentage scale of 0 to 100, where was I on that scale? Was I at 100? Was I further down from that? What we're going to do next week is we're going to have a look at how we can examine where we are on that scale, and if that is where we need to be on that scale, and if it isn't, how we move ourselves up or down. So we're now at the practice task for this week, and I realise that all the way through this I've been saying about doing the handout 10. It's not handout 10 at all, it's handout 6, and handout 6 goes from 1 to 10 and covers all the emotions that we've looked at and more. So your practice task this week is to observe and describe emotion handouts 5 and 6, to read through those, and to complete worksheets 4 and 4A, and to complete an emotion diary. So using worksheets 2B and 2C. And what's really useful about this is you're going to be looking at your emotions a bit more depth, getting to know their emotional signatures a bit better, and being able to identify what's happening for you. So we've come to the end of this PowerPoint. Okay. What I'd like you to do is just pause, think about what are you taking away from you? What are you taking away from you? What are you taking away with you from this session? And then to write down something that makes you smile. And I will see you next week.